There's a famous African proverb about lions, hunters, and the power of stories that I like to think about. This is a quote that is often adopted and cited by philosophers, historians, and politicians, but I've always cared for the proverb as a person who studies literature, for what it has to say about stories and the enlightening effects that they can have on readers. Similarly enough, I find a very similar message within the pages of the recent Black Panther series, written by author Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm going to be honest and say that it's not quite a comic that revels in action and fight scenes like most other series, but instead revels in dialectics, discussing philosophy, political theory, and socio-cultural principles. Of the many comments and insights Coates gives, there's an ongoing discussion about the power of stories that he commonly brings up. And this is what I'd like to discuss. Not only for the comments he makes about stories, but also the way in which he presents them. I find it all to be very meta-literary, literature talking about literature. And so I'd like to talk about the themes, style, and context behind Coates' first volume of Black Panther, A Nation Under Our Feet. Ta-Nehisi Coates' first complete story arc begins with the Black Panther T'Challa living in a Wakanda that is very much mired in social upset. Having endured not one, but 3 catastrophes in recent years, the people of the Golden City are tense and jaded with their nation. As a result, Black Panther finds himself pursuing rebels who have taken advantage of the dissatisfied Wakandan people for both noble and personal goals. Under these circumstances, one could imagine Coates exploring a wide variety of themes that discuss social policy, political reform, and general philosophy. And he does, as Coates has quite the background and experience in discussing such topics in his past. We see T'Challa try to pacify his people, both as a king and a hero. And while these events certainly merit their own analysis and discussion, I personally find fascination in a far different facet of the story arc: the events surrounding Shuri, sister of T'Challa. As a result of Jonathan Hickman's build-up to Secret Wars, Shuri, the former queen of Wakanda, now lies in a comatose state, after being brutally beaten by an extraterrestrial force in an effort to protect her kingdom. However, Shuri still lives and grows as a character in her own personal story arc, as her catatonic circumstance has given her the opportunity to reconnect with a past and heritage that she had unconsciously neglected. Being transported to the Jalia, the plane of Wakandan memory, Shuri finds herself with a spiritual Griot, with the appearance of her mother. Shocked and unsure of her situation, Shuri is hesitant at first, but decides to hear out the ancestral spirit and learn from her as well as her folkloric stories. Of the many conversations Shuri and the Griot share, the first comes as a lesson that helps set the tone of what this spiritual journey will discuss. The Griot comments on how Shuri has grown to believe that Wakanda's greatness has always been in its use of vibranium, but goes on to explain that the nation was glorious even before the advent of the precious metal. The Griot explains that this has become her mission for the fallen queen, to remind her of the power of Wakandan heritage, the power of their memory, the power of their song. The Griot begins to recount of the prosperous Wakandan duchy of the past. Having thrived for many years independently prior to the advent of vibranium, the duchy had garnered a reputation in its corner of the globe. So much so, that invaders sought to seize the society's wealth and resources for themselves. Now, such a circumstance isn't necessarily out of the ordinary in world history, but the key idea from this history lesson comes when the Griot explains how the unmilitarized government of the duchy responded to the invasive force. By melting itself back into its own populace, and fighting back as an entire community. Most every member of the duchy contributed to fight off and pester the invaders, and through their united effort, they won. The lesson, the Griot concludes, is a grassroots reminder of the power of the people in a country. Either you are a nation, or you are nothing. The second lesson we see Shuri and the Griot have concerns a bit more of an ambiguous tale. The Griot tells of a Wakandan village lost to history that has lived high in the mountains and amongst the clouds. Her tale focuses on a Wakandan woman named Ife, who along with many other women of her village, was seized and sold as a slave. Her captors, cautious and fearful, blindfolded these women, fearing that should they see the light of the sky, they would remember the freedom and power that they had in their village amongst the clouds. Ife was eventually sold to an old man who hid her in his basement, made her his wife, and had her raise his children. But despite this attempt to bind the Wakandan villager, her spirit did not break, and she longed for liberation. Years passed until one day, for some mysterious reason, the old man decided to release Ife from his basement, and show her once again the light of day. Upon seeing the sun welcome Ife once again, her spirit met the sky as she burst forth as a flock of birds to rejoice in her freedom. The lesson, the Griot concludes, is that while one may be bound and shackled by others physically, only oneself can allow themselves to be bound spiritually, for there is no fist wide enough to hide the sky. The third lesson is not one given by the Griot, but rather one initiated and reflected upon by Shuri herself. Shuri shares a story that she recalls, and tells of a Wakandan village boy named Oronde. The fastest youth in all his village, Oronde soon garnered a reputation for his speed until one day he was confronted by a cheetah that demanded a race with him. The cheetah mocked Oronde as a village boy and boasted his own reputation as being faster than Flame. On the day of their race, a crowd gathered to watch the two speed, but Oronde's mind was clouded by self-doubt from the cheetah's words. He lost and was mocked by the cheetah, never ceasing to call him a village boy at any chance he had. Rematch after rematch, Oronde continued to lose to the cheetah, until the one day he had decided to seek guidance from a Wakandan shaman. The shaman spoke of how just before each race, Oronde had already accepted defeat by dwelling on the cheetah's words. He truly thought of himself as nothing better than just a village boy. Finding motivation in this insight, Oronde returned to the cheetah, presenting himself not as some village boy, but rather as the beast's master. The two raced, and Oronde came out victorious, and with a new name, Oronde who mastered the flame. The lesson of this story is never explicitly stated. The Griot chooses not to lecture Shuri as she did in the past, for this was her story, and Shuri for sure understands its meaning without realizing it. Later, away from the Griot, we see Shuri find personal strength from reflecting upon Oronde's story. The next and final lesson comes just moments before T'Challa rescues Shuri from her catatonic state in the Jalia. Aware of their fleeting time together, the Griot asks Shuri to go over what she has learned from their time together. Shuri guides her mentor to a space full of ruins, and tells of how these ruins were of the past Wakandan people who unified the nation and brought forth one of the land's many dynasties. She focuses her tale on the people's queen, Sologon, who grew as a woman rebellious towards the traditions and customs of her people. Growing up, she was mocked and mistreated time and time again, but she maintained her steady spirit. By the time she was a mother and had told her own son to keep his spirit strong as well, her people found themselves approached by invaders. Ready to abandon their arms and surrender to the fleet, Sologon, with her unbridled will, shamed the men who were so willing to give up. She took up the soldiers' arms and marched towards the invaders, and soon found herself followed by men who were in awe and respect of her unrelenting fire, of her spirit of iron, of her skin of stone. Seconds before Shuri's brother brings her back to the realm of the living, Shuri and the Griot share their goodbyes, but not before the mystical spirit grants the Wakandan Queen her new title as Aja Adana, Keeper of the Wakandan lore, to teach the world that which they have forgotten. Back in T'Challa's lab, the Wakandan king finds himself with his revived sister, who tells him that while she has discovered nothing, she now remembers everything. With the two siblings united once more, T'Challa and Shuri go on to calm the revolution boiling within their kingdom, and address the needs, wants, and fears of their people. But as I said before, I feel Shuri's spiritual journey to be the most worth discussion. My favorite thing about Shuri's time in the ancestral plane is without a doubt the way in which Ta-Nehisi Coates treats the effects of the stories being told between the two characters. Not only does Shuri metaphorically grow from hearing fantastical stories that allow her to rediscover the pride in Wakanda's past, but she also grows in a more literal sense, by gaining the powers and attributes of the characters in these folkloric legends. There's a specific name I would give to this style of storytelling, wherein fantastical and phenomenal events happen in a realistic setting to help reveal a more profound truth. Magical realism. Now, some of you may recall that I already discussed the literary style in a previous video. However, there is still much that can be said about the literary device. For example, Ta-Nehisi Coates gives a meta-literary presentation of magical realism within two levels of his story. There is the subject of magical realism, as seen in the effect that the Wakandan folklore have on Shuri's powers, and then there is the effect of magical realism as a genre, as we see in how Shuri uses her powers to heal the troubled nation of Wakanda. Now, in my previous video, I mentioned that magical realism seeks to reveal social or moral truths through the presentation of fantastical elements in a real-world setting. But there's a special detail that needs to be considered in order to differentiate magical realism from myths and folklore. There needs to be a clear gap in believability. Some sort of contrast that not only complements the fantastical elements of the story, but also make the reader go, wait, is this really happening? And this juxtaposition best happens when these magical elements occur in a more modern setting. In the stories shared between Shuri and the Griot, Ife's spiritual liberation, Oronde's encounter with the cheetah, and Sologon's skin of stone are all examples of the magic in their worlds. But because these worlds are of the past, and we as readers just naturally have a hard time empathizing and relating with the past, these stories feel much more like myths and legends. Instead, I would say the magical realism of Ta-Nehisi Coates' story comes forth only after Shuri is revived, since we see the magical elements of her country's history manifest in a modern era guided by technology rather than cultural principles. And this juxtaposition is agreed upon by others as necessary to magical realism as well. According to African Studies professor Brenda Cooper, magical realism arises out of particular societies, post-colonial, unevenly developed places where old and new, modern and ancient, the scientific and the magical views of the world coexist. It grapples with cultural syncretism, or the attempt to compromise and make sense of two starkly different principles, and accepts it to a greater or lesser extent. Where syncretism is rejected, it is usually the result of pressure arising out of national disaster, which insists on writers' obligation to engage in national liberation. This explanation by Professor Cooper speaks true to the implementation of magical realism in the pages of A Nation Under Our Feet. We see Shuri, transformed into an agent of past culture, engage and interact with her people, agents of modern culture. And while this all makes for interesting storytelling for the reader, it's not unreasonable to pose the question of, why have the past and modern interact in the first place? And this brings me to the effect of the genre of magical realism in real life. To set up the discussion, the crisis of national security and sense of identity that we witness in the fictional nation of Wakanda suffer through is in fact a very real phenomenon that has a history of appearing and reappearing throughout all parts of the globe. However, the root of the crisis, as well as the response of the denizens of the nation, is more often than not shared amongst real-world countries that have adopted Western culture through colonialism. Now, while the nation of Wakanda, to my knowledge, has never been colonized by the West as we would traditionally consider in real life, Ta-Nehisi Coates' interpretation of the nation definitely seems like one that has adopted Western tendencies, and the motivic dependence that the nation has on its vibranium resource can serve as a more self-serving parallel to the behavior of most European colonies with respect to their natural resources. As a result, both the fictional nation and the actual nations who shared this resource-focused economic motivation reached the same tunnel vision conclusion. The nations' identities lie in their materials. We even see Shuri insist upon this perspective of Wakanda at first, claiming that the advancement of vibranium was what made Wakandan culture glorious, and that prior to the arrival of the precious metal, Wakandan culture was uncivilized, as if the metal was the central key that made Wakandans civil. This idea that the culture and society of pre-colonial nations was uncivilized is most definitely shared by nations recovering from their colonial eras, and is often reinforced by their colonizers, since they are typically the ones whose history is usually heard the most. This perspective is one that often leads to dilemma when the colonialist societies reach an almost inevitable socio-political crisis from the nation's overemphasis on the worth of their economic resources as the root of their cultural worth. When moments of tragedy or crisis occurs, it's pretty hard to keep believing that some metal, fruit, or crop are really the brand image of a society. And having abandoned their love for their cultural past under the pretext of being uncivilized, colonial nations in crisis have nowhere to look for a firm grasp of their identity. Now, as Professor Cooper mentions, magical realism has a tendency to appear in post-colonial cultures, much like the one I've just described. They serve as a reminder of a past and heritage that colonized nations can hold on to, while also paying attention to the modern concerns and issues of these countries in distress. They act as a sort of medicine for these nations by fulfilling their desire for cultural identity, while also providing guidance to help them out of their modern dilemmas. And this is in fact what we see Shuri do after having learned of Wakanda's neglected history. Her new character and the actions she performs are all metaphors for the effect and nature of magical realism as a genre. All in all, the world of Wakanda as interpreted by Ta-Nehisi Coates not only presents us with impactful character arcs, meaningful plot, and thought-provocative ideas, but also serves as a rather exemplary meta-literary model of the style and effects of the magical realism genre. To anybody who may ask, what's the point of magical realism? I believe that Shuri's return to Wakanda as an empowered queen is an excellent demonstration of the merits and beauty of the complex literary style.